Okay, so in this series, I'm going to show you guys how to use Substance Painter and Blender to get better results from the work that you've done in Clo3d. So this is the final outcome of this workflow using Substance and Blender. The level of detail is pretty nice, and I'm going to show you guys how to set this up. The first thing I'm going to do is go to Clo and show you how my files are set up. So the point of this tutorial is not to show you guys how to use Clo, it's to show you what to do with your models in Clo and how to get these into Substance Painter and into Blender in the end. So this is the look that I've created in Clo. There is a print and some graphics inserted into the leather fabric and on the t-shirt. And if we look closely as well, we have some puckering details as well applied to this model. So around the seams of the pants and the jacket, there is also puckering applied. We have top stitches as well, and we have some textures applied to the zippers as well. So this is all stuff that we can take out of Clo, and we can take this into Substance Painter with us in order to add some detail. So if I go now into the UV editing workspace, by clicking this menu in the top right and going down to UV, I'll show you how these UVs are set up. So for the jacket, I've spread these pieces out across two tiles. In order to maximize the resolution of the texture, I spread it across two UV tiles. For the internal part of the jacket, for the lining, that's not really visible, I put this into one tile. For the zip details here and for some of these little metal components in the belt and on the ends of the zips, I've given these as much texture resolution as possible. Um, for the zips, I actually cut these into individual pieces, so each zip is about 3 pattern pieces in itself in order to fit these in the UV pieces a little better. These are the trim pieces for the zip pullers and for this buckle right here, and for these metal snaps. And the t-shirt is within one UV tile, and for the neck trim, I've actually given this a larger scaling in order to give this more texture resolution and have a finer detail in the collar. And then the trouser and the pant pieces are all placed across two tiles as well. The important thing to remember in this process is to keep each material with its own scaling. So for example, I wouldn't want to scale this piece bigger than the rest of the pieces because this would have a different texture resolution than the other pieces in the layout. So remember to keep all of your material selections in one scale and keep things uniform and keep things as efficiently placed in each UV tile as possible. So this one actually goes over 8 UVs in total, and this is the first thing that we can start to export from Clo. So I've set up a folder structure for this project. I'm going to go into a texture folder that I've created, and I have a Clo exports folder. And in here, I'm going to export some of the text and some of the maps that we've created in Clo already. So the way that we're going to do this is using this bake option right here, and that's the second icon down with the camera on the right side by your fabric property editor. Hit this icon and then choose a path, and I've just copied my path from the folder I was in before, so that's going to go into here. And then give this a name as base material, and we're going to click save. And for this we want to take the diffuse and we want to take the normal map as well, and we can look at the normal map in a second. But we want to take both of these channels with us into Substance. And we want to check that we're taking all the tiles, so we take all these tiles that we've laid out. I'm going to use a 4K resolution, and there's 2 pixels of texture or fill in the texture. So these settings are good to work with, and I'm going to click save. And then Clo is going to start to bake these textures out into the folder that we've just created. So in that folder, if we go and look now that the baking is finished, we can see that we have a series of image textures for the base material and then a series of image textures for the normal maps. And if we look in Clo, if I close this window, I click this icon here in the middle and click the option next to it, this will let me look at the UV layout in normal map view. And now I can zoom in on the normal maps and I see that I have a lot of puckering detail that is applied to these image textures that I've now also taken from Clo. So those are the first two things we wanted to export from our Clo file. The next thing we want to take is some height maps for the stitches, because right now the top stitches are all set to textures. So we actually have a lot of top stitching details on this jacket, and I want to use a texturing process for these stitches and not have them objects. So I've set up a second Clo file for this, and I'll explain how this is set up. So if I look first at the stitches, I have my top stitching options here, and I have jacket stitches and jean stitches. And these are both going to be, when you work in Clo by default, these usually get set to OBJ, and that is visible under the type here. So if you look in the property editor on the right side, it says type, and I have this set to texture. In this menu, it can be OBJ or texture, and I want to work with texture. So I've set both my jacket and my jeans stitches to texture, and I've set their color to white. So there's a completely white value. And for all the fabrics, all the base fabrics, I've selected all of these materials and set those base colors all to black, so to completely black. And the reason I've done that is so that when I look at this in the UV editing workspace, with the same UV layout as the previous file that I was in, if I zoom in now, my top stitches are visible as black and white information, and this can be used in Substance to create a height map and to create masks in order to make these stitches visible without using geometry and just by using the texturing system. And this is going to be a lot quicker to render rather than having each one of these stitches created from geometry. So we want to bake this out, and we're going to do that in the same way we did before. So we have this whole set of tiles of black and white information. I'm going to click the camera icon here, the second one down. I'm going to go to the folder structure from before. I'm going to import stitches as my the name of these maps. I'm going to click save, and I just want to take the diffuse because we already have the normal map. So I select diffuse. The rest of the settings stay the same from how we were before, and I click save. And now this will be saved out in the same way the previous ones were. And if we check when this is done in the folder structure we've created, we now have the stitch maps in this folder as well. There's one more set of maps we want to take from Clo into Substance before we start to work in Substance, and that is some ID maps. And this is how I've set up the project for IDs. So I've completely removed all of the graphic components from this project, so there's no graphics on the t-shirt or graphics in the fabrics anymore. And each separate fabric that I want to work with in Substance as a different material has been assigned an identifying color in Clo. These colors are not for my design, these are just as identifiers in order to select different materials whilst we're working in Substance Painter. And this will become clear when we start to work in Substance Painter, but what we want to do now is assign each material its own color. And for the stitches, I've turned these off, and the way I did that was to actually just set the opacity value to 0. I just completely set the opacity to a value of 0 here for both the sets of stitches. And if I look at this in the UV editor mode now, I will have a series of colored identifiers for all of these different fabrics. And if I zoom in, none of the stitches are visible because we've already created a mask for the stitches. We just want to identify the base materials. So we can save this as well in the same way. We click the Bake Texture button. We only want to take the diffuse. We're in the same folder structure as before. Put ID as the name of this export and click Save. Again, just the diffuse channel. We'll click Save for this. And Clo will bake out these textures for us into the folder that we selected. So if I look here, we now have a set of base colors, a set of normal maps, we have a set of ID maps, and then we have a set of maps to use as masks for stitches. So this is the setup of image textures we want to take into Substance Painter with us. And the next thing we want to do is export the geometry. So the 3D object that we want to work with. So I'm going to go back to my original Clo file. So you can see I do actually have 3 versions of this file saved for these different reasons, so I'll show you that. So there's the base color, the one for the IDs, and the one for the stitches. What I'm going to do is export this one with the the original project that I worked on. So if I go into the simulation workspace and I go to File, Export, and OBJ, there's there's two things we want to export and one thing that we need to fix. So I'll just move these files into a folder called old because I did this before. The first one we want to do is export a thin jacket. So, well, a thin jacket and the whole look. So if I call this thin look and save, we can set this export in these export settings here to thin. And I'll explain thick and thin when we go into Blender, but for now we want a thin one. So if I click thin here, I select unweld, single object, and I uncheck the select all avatars box because I don't want to take the avatar with me. I want to have unified UV coordinates because these are the UV layouts that we've selected here. We want them scaling to be in meters because Blender is working in meters. And the rest of the settings we can leave as they are. The main things to check is thin and unified UV coordinates, and I don't want to take the avatar with me, I just want to take the garments. So all patterns and all graphics, and I click OK. I will export one of these objects into the folder, and then I'm going to repeat that process, File, Export, OBJ, and then I'm going to call this thick look, and click Save. And again, I'm going to select thick this time. This will be set to unweld by default. I'm going to have a single object, unselect the select avatars box because I don't want the avatar. I want all patterns and all graphics selected, meters, same settings as before, except the thick, and then click OK. And now we should have two different exports inside our folders that we've created before. So if I look in my folder and I go to the geometry folder I created, I will now have, these can go into old, a thin look and a thick look. And these are the two files that I can work with now. So I have two OBJ files and two material files that are with those, but the OBJ files are the ones that I want to work with. So what I'm going to do now is go into Blender and I'm going to create a new scene. And I'm going to import these objects that we've exported from Clo3d. So if you've never been to Blender before, welcome. I've done a video about working with Blender previously, so I'll put a link to that. The first thing we want to do is select this cube, press X and delete it. I'm going to go quickly through Blender, so if you've not used it before, I do advise you watch the other video and get used to the workspace. But for now, we're not doing anything too complex. So if I go now to File, Import, and OBJ, and then I navigate to my exports folder from before. So I go to the geometry folder and I import the thin object. So if I import thin look and I click import, we now have our export inside Blender. And the one thing we need to clean up before we go into Substance is the material IDs. I look on the right side of the screen in this kind of property editor here, and you choose this red circular icon. This is our material and property editor. And if we look in here, we can see that there's a lot more materials applied to this model than we had originally in Clo3d. And we have one material slot for each of the fabrics we had before, as they were named, and then we have some additional material slots as well. And these additional ones are for all of the small trim components that we've added to this garment. So we really want to work with one material ID inside Substance instead of these multiple materials. And the way we fix this is to start at the bottom of this list of materials. So go all the way to the bottom, choose this subtract icon here on the side, and it will remove each of these material slots and it will shuffle it into the one above. So each of these will now be combined with the one above it. And I go all the way to the top until I see jacket, body, and sleeves. And if I look on the top right side of the screen and I choose the second icon in called viewport shading, I look at this in viewport shading now, and under the base color in the material controls on the right, if I choose this color here and I just add a color, I can see now that this material, this blue material that we've created, is affecting this entire 3D model. So we have one material affecting all of the model, and this is what we want to work with inside Substance. So if I select this, I go to File, Export, OBJ. I go to the folder I was in before, so the geometry folder, and I call this thin look material. And I'm going to limit this export on the right side here. I'll click limit to selected objects, so it's just the object that is selected in orange in the viewport. The other information I can leave the same. I just click export OBJ. And now if I look back in my folder, I will have an additional export called look thin materials. And this is the one we want to work with inside Substance Painter. So we've gone from Clo quickly into Blender to clean up some material slots, and we've exported some textures. So at this point, the main things we need to have is these three OBJ exports, a thick export, a thin export, and a thin export with the materials corrected in Blender like we just did. And we want to have the textures exported from Clo. So if I look here, I've got all these texture files exported from Clo. These are what we want to start to work with inside Substance Painter. So here we are in Substance Painter, and I'm going to quickly import this asset that we just created in Blender. So if I go to my folder structure, I go to the geometry folder, I choose the thin look materials that we just exported out of Blender. I'm going to drag this into the left side of the screen, and this is the project setup. So for document resolution, I'm going to set this to 4K, 4096, and for the normal map option, I'm going to set this to OpenGL. Right now, the template is PBR Metallic Roughness Alpha Blend, and this is what we want to set it to so that we can work with almost all the channels that we need for this project. UV's settings here, you use the UV tile workflow, check this option because otherwise we'll have some issues with the UDIM, so make sure this is checked, and everything else you can leave as it is. The main thing to check is OpenGL for Blender. Document resolution is 4096. You can set this to 2K if you're running on a lower end graphics card, let's say, but you can always export in the end at 4K. So even if you're viewing the document in 2K, we can export in a different resolution after. For now, everything's set up and we click OK, and the scene will load, and inside Substance we will now view our 3D model on the left and our 2D workspace on the right. So just a quick introduction to the controls. Using Alt and click will allow you to kind of grab and move the model. Alt and right click will allow you to zoom in and out, and Alt and middle mouse will allow you to grab and move around the screen in this way. So these are the controls on this side of the screen, and they're the same on the 2D workspace as well. So you'll see the UV tiles that we laid out inside Clo are all represented here, and the model is visible on the left side of the screen. To adjust the lighting, we can press Shift and right click, and we will rotate the light in the workspace in order to change how we visualize the material. And then a quick explanation of the other elements. On the left side, we have our asset library or our shelf, where we have textures and smart materials imported to. On the right side, we have a property editor. So right now we have a paint layer activated, and this property editor is allowing us to edit the brush settings of this paint layer. We will work in this space a lot. We'll work in this space on the left less frequently, and the things in this right menu here we'll use even less often. So the one thing to look is the computer screen kind of icon here will allow you to change the environment map, and there's a lot of different environments that are visible here. Choose one that works for you, but we're going to change these throughout the project to check how how each material looks in a different light. But that's how you can change the environment, exposure, blur, and various settings here. The shader settings underneath this. This is our texture set list, and right now we have one list of textures. This is the one material slot we created in Blender, and this eye will turn on and off that material view. If we hadn't have cleaned those materials up, we'd have had a lot of material IDs in here, and right now we have one, which is what we wanted to work with. And this is Substance. This is where we're going to do most of the work right now. The first thing we want to do is import the image textures from Clo. And we do that by going to our texture folder. If I look in textures and I go to my Clo exports folder, I can shift and select all of these textures that we've created, drag them into the shelf on the left, and then Painter will give us this import window. What I'm going to do is select the top material and press Ctrl and A to select all of these image textures. And then in the undefined section, I'm going to select texture. And that will apply a texture identifier to all of these images that we've imported. And I want to import these resources into this project. The reason for that is these resources are only valuable to this 3D model for this project. They're not valuable to other projects that I might work on in the future. They're just valid to this one. So for now, I'll bring this into the project and I'll click import. And now I have on the left side of the screen, each of these image texture sets is imported into its own kind of slot. And you see the number 8 is written on the front of them because there's 8 tiles that are packed into this one image texture. We know that this has been imported correctly because it says the 8 on top and all the other textures are kind of placed behind it for the base texture, the normal, the ID, and the stitches. What we're going to do now is we're going to save this project. I'll call this version 4. Now we've imported these resources in the model we can save, and then we'll build a base material to introduce how these image textures work. So the first thing I'll do is delete on the right side this paint layer. I'd right click and click remove layers and it's gone. I'm going to add folder, and in the folder I'm going to add a fill. And the reason I'm adding folders is because for each folder we're going to build a different material with a different identifier. So if I go to this fill layer right here and I look in the property editors above, this fill layer is affecting all these different channels from color, height, roughness, metallic, normal, opacity, and emission. And I can input values into all of these different channels. So that if I go to base color and I choose this color here, I can then select a base color for this material, for example, red. And now my material is shaded in red. I can look at, for example, the roughness. I could move this left into the black end of the slider to get a shinier looking model, or I could move this up the other way to the right side to get a rougher, like a less shiny looking model. I could use the metallic slider further in the white direction to get something that looks metallic. So by combining those two roughness and metallic channels, I can get something that looks like a metallic red material quite quickly. I could change the red, I could make this look a bit gold maybe. And this is how we can start to create layers of different materials on the side here. I want this channel, for example, to affect only the color. So if I wanted to just limit this to a color channel, I could click on these other channels in the top right side and just turn them off. So if I click them one by one, each one of them will be deactivated until I'm just left this time with color. And that means I'm just creating a color layer. So what I'm going to do is name this folder base material so that we know what we're creating. So it's good to name things as we go along. And then I can call this layer color, for example. So I know what I'm creating. So I'll change this color to red so that it's more visible what we're about to do. What I could do now with this base material is I could right click on this and click add a black mask. And now my color selection has kind of disappeared. And that is what we want to do, because now we could mask off this model and just paint in areas that we want to have red. So for example, if I wanted to have a red sleeve, I could paint over this sleeve and just have a red sleeve, for example. And this means now any material that I create under this folder will be applied only to this part of the model where I've created a black mask. So if I wanted to input, say, this golden kind of aluminium texture, I could drop this into the base material folder that I've created here. This will layer on top, and now this material is just applied to the sleeve. If I want to mask this off again, I choose the black mask here that I've just created in the folder, and I start to paint out more of this mask to be visible. So that's how we can work with manually painting masks in. But that's not what we want to do. We want to do this in a more procedural way. But a thing to note is that Painter is going to work in layer stacks from top to bottom. So because we've added the aluminium insulator material on top of the color material, it's reading that one first and the color one last. But if I change the order of these, it will read the color one first and it will read the aluminium last. And what we see here is that it's taking the color value from this one, and then over that it's layering the channels from this material as well. So we've created a red overlay, but we still have the metallic and roughness and all the other details from the material underneath. So this will create stacks and stacks of detail, and that's what we want to do. And be aware that this goes from top to bottom, and we can create different masks for these materials by creating either black masks or white masks over these folders. So I'm going to delete this aluminium material, and I'm going to delete this mask, and I can right click and clear the mask, and then if I right click and click remove mask, the mask is gone, and we're just working with a single color across this whole model. What I want to do now is use some of the texture maps that I've created in. So if I come up here and I search for base material, so I search base in here, and now I have my base material image textures here. I'm going to drag these textures over here, and I'm going to drop them into this base material channel right there. And Painter has now read those material textures into this material ID that we've created, and we now have the base colors applied to this model. What we could do now is add a normal channel to this. So if I click normal, I now have a normal input channel, and I can drag the base material normal maps with the puckering details on that we had before. So I drag these normal maps into this normal slot, and we have now the puckering visible on this model. So this is how we input those basic inputs. The last one we want to add is a height map to make the stitches visible. So if I go in here and I type in stitches, I've got my stitch maps here. Again, the ones we exported from Clo. I'm going to drag these into this height slot here, and you will see the stitches are visible in a more three-dimensional way. Even though this isn't offsetting the geometry at all, this is just working with texturing, and now the stitches are visible. If these look a bit too intense, the amount of bump that's being used, what we can do is look at how these blending options work. So right now we have a height channel that is a bit too intense. So we know that this is the height input, and if I come down to the right side of this base material and I choose base color and I choose height, I'm now affecting the height blending options. And if I choose this color, this layer that we've created called color, which I'm now going to rename as base material, if I select this 100% value here, I drop this menu open and I slide this down, this will reduce the intensity of those top stitches. So if I turn this to 0, there's no bump information on these top stitches, it's just two-dimensional. And if I increase this slightly to a 15 value, for example, I can now see some of the impression of these stitches. This is visible as well if I go to the middle of the screen here and I have this material menu and I drop this menu down. These are my different channels that I can view. So if I look under single channel and I look at normal, height plus mesh, I can see now that my normal map that I'm starting to create has stitches visible in the normal map. It has zip information visible in the normal map, and it has puckering information visible in the normal map. So this is all stuff that we've created in Clo, stuff that we laid out in our Clo file, and it's details that we've now brought into Substance. So if I look at this in material mode, we can see now that we have this base material set up from our Clo file. So I'll leave it at this point for now. In the next video, I'll show you how to set this up for each material in look, so one for the t-shirt, the jacket, and all the different material identifiers that we have. So yeah, let's go to part 2 and add some more details to this model.